Hello everybody, thank you for joining me this evening, for logging in and being here virtually. I hope you can all hear me. Let me just give you a little bit of background to me and what I do. As David said, I work at Mary Evans Picture Library, and prior to that I actually used to manage the Illustrated London News archive, which consisted of 9 separate magazines, all very popular illustrated magazines of the late 19th and early 20th century. I won't go through the whys and wherefores, but that archive is now housed at Mary Evans Picture Library, and I've been working there since 2007, and since ILN since 2003. So I spent, gosh, how long is that? 17 years now working with the ILN archive, which consists of magazines like the Illustrated London News, the Graphic, the Sphere, the Bystander, the Tatler, and the Sketch. Now, all of these magazines are absolutely, an incredibly rich resource for illustration of all kinds of things, but particularly cartoons. And, I realised that and had some chats with publishers back in 2007. And anyway, my very first book was about First World War cartoons, because it was a period when all these magazines were in publication, all churning out cartoons on a weekly basis. And so my first book, Brushes and Bayonets, came out in 2008. And so a lot of the material I'm going to show you tonight is from those magazines, and sort of based a little bit on that book that I did quite a few years ago now, but it's also augmented with a lot of material from Mary Evans Picture Library, such as material from Punch. So let's, without further ado, let's start. Let's start with a very early cartoon of the Great War. Oh, here we go. It's not working. Right, here we go. Sorry, I'm having to scroll because my buttons aren't working, but this is the front cover of the Graphic, and it features a cartoon by David Wilson. Now, David Wilson was born in Northern Ireland. He moved to the UK as a young man, and he became a cartoonist for a number of magazines, but between 1910 and 1916, he was the chief cartoonist for the Graphic. So he was the one that this magazine, the Graphic, called on for their very first issue of the war. Now, look at the date on that. That's August the 8th, 1914. So within just a few days, Wilson had not only created that cartoon, but it had also, gone through the printing presses and out onto the newsstands. And Wilson has presented Germany in a very typical manner for those first few months of the war. Very foreboding, very brutal. He's personified Germany as a Roman centurion, sort of trampling innocents of Belgium underfoot there. So I'm always very careful about assuming that cartoonists believe in what they're drawing. Did David Wilson think this about Germany? Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But certainly what happened in this period, these first few weeks, is the magazines, the media, the press, and the cartoonists who worked for them all really galvanized together and presented a united front. And there's a really interesting quote from David Wilson, who was writing in Drawing magazine in 1915. And he says, "When Germany launched her thunderbolt last August and the warlord thrust his sword into the delicate machinery of civilization, among those who were the first to suffer from the crash and to come in contact with the raw edge of changed circumstance were those cartoonists who found their subjects from day to day in the interplay of the weapons party politics. They suddenly found that the puppets which had fought their way through many campaigns to bloodless victories at St. Stephen's and Spring Gardens had got to be tucked away, some of them no doubt for good. The curtain in that dark week was raised on a changed scene. The comparatively peaceful background of English politics had gone. In its place was the lurid background of international strife." So David Wilson and some of the cartoonists I'm going to feature in this talk had, before the war, really been political cartoonists, often taking sides between parties. And now that was completely cast aside. And now there was just one common enemy, and that was Germany. So what's quite interesting is this cartoon by David Wilson is also from the graphic. And this is 3 years later, 1917. And really his approach to depicting the enemy hasn't changed at all. Germany's war aimed peace and a sword. So, perhaps David Wilson is, quite anti-German here. What's quite interesting is he also designed this poster for the British Empire Union. I don't know whether anybody knows much about this, but it started as, talk about calling a spade, the anti-German union. And it was, it stood for patriotism, social reform, industrial peace, promotion of the empire. And what it really, really didn't want was for enemy aliens to be allowed back into Britain after the war and to become naturalized subjects. So there you can see this poster, is post-war. And remember, every German employed means a British worker idle. And it's quite an interesting poster in today's political climate. So David Wilson wasn't the only one who was depicting the Germans in this way. This is by Frank Reynolds. Frank Reynolds is a really famous cartoonist, and I'll be showing one of the most famous cartoons of the Great War by him in a little while. But here he is, and again, this is a brutish, ignorant German, women and children, again, just fallen underfoot. And then we've also got this by Edmund Sullivan. Now, Edmund Sullivan was first and foremost a book illustrator, which you can really see in this style. He worked a lot in pen and ink, and he was greatly influenced by Albrecht Dürer, actually. And I just wanted to show this picture here, which is a typical Dürer woodcut. So you can sort of see the parallels over several centuries. But in the early part of 1915, Sullivan created a series of illustrations called the Kaiser's Garland, which were exhibited at the Leicester Galleries and later published in book form by Heinemann. And, they're a really striking and powerful anti-German comment. And this is one picture which really sums up Sullivan's style at the time. He's got these huge, almost, figures which could almost be coming out of Grimm's fairy tales. Here's the Kaiser as an ogre. Again, there was those big shiny boots and the skull helmet, and he's almost coming out of that framework. And that isn't typical, really, of British cartoonists, but, it's a very potent image. And here's another one. And Sullivan really doesn't, make any bones about it. The beast breaks loose, culture, as it appears to Edmund J. Sullivan. And he literally is presenting the Germans or Germany as a brutish beast. So this cover from the Bystander is by an artist called Alec P.F. Ritchie, who was really, really versatile and drew in lots of different styles. But what's quite interesting about this one is the title of the picture, Culture. And this concept of culture and the dichotomy between how Germans perceived their own culture and what the British were seeing was often used as a kind of theme in cartoons at the time. So, it was clearly exaggerated in the British press, but there were definite reports of the German army behaving in a pretty despicable manner as they invaded and marched through Belgium. The burning of the Library of Louvain was the antithesis of culture as far as the British were concerned. So here we have a drunk German soldier who's clearly raided some nice wine cellars somewhere, hiding behind that mask of culture. So there is this presentation of Germany as, the ogre of the beast, the mad dog of Europe in those early weeks. And it was all very much tied in with, drumming up people wishing to join up and, presenting Germany as, the very worst of civilization. But there were plenty of cartoonists who took a different approach. And, I often think that there are two sides to depicting them. And one is to show them as, terrifying and frightening people into hating them. And then the other side is to mock them and to ridicule them. And sometimes that can be just as powerful as showing them the other way. So this chap here is F.H. Townsend, Frederick Townsend, who was the art editor of Punch. He was actually Punch's very first art editor. And he drew this cartoon, which actually is very much in the Victorian tradition of Punch cartoons, that single page. But what he's doing here is he's showing Germany as an old man, portly and bullying brave little Belgian with his club. And you see those very plumptious sausages coming out of his pocket. If you're ever wanting to ridicule the Germans, you show some sausages. And this, was a really iconic image at the time and summed up how the British perceived Belgium as the brave little country standing up to this brutish enemy. So the perception of Germans as this military nation had really been sort of gnawing away at the British for quite some time. And this cartoon, which I have to remind myself who it's by actually, Frank Gillett. It was published, I think, in the Bystander, but in 1909. And this is If England Became German. And this is a series that appeared in the magazine. And this is a day at Lord's. So you can see that, Day at Lord's is rather marred by these very humorless German soldiers. You've got the German flag flying over the stand, and there's W.H. Schmidt rather than W.H. Smith selling magazines in the background. And this is all very much tied in with a feeling around 1909, 1910 of fear about Germans' increasing militarism, about the naval race of, that they were, the British were building ships, so were Germany, and this general suspicion about German motives. And a lot of this was hung on a series of articles written by Robert Blatchford in the Daily Mail, which warned of the German menace and what might happen if there was an invasion. Which at the time seemed incredibly hysterical. I think we'd probably feel the same way now. And of course, within a few years, this hysteria turned out to be, well-founded. So probably the kind of master of ridiculing the Germans is this man. This is William Heath Robinson. And you'll all know him as the Gadget King, the creator of ridiculously convoluted contraptions, which he often invented to achieve what was basically a very simple aim. Now, Heath Robinson was too old to join up when war broke out. He was always I think he was about 42. And but he did a marvellous job with his cartoons at the time. He'd already established himself as a book illustrator, and then he began to draw for the Tatler, but it was particularly the Sketch magazine that really made his name. And in fact, in his autobiography, he says, "I was fairly launched on my career as a humorous artist on the editor of the Sketch's decision to publish his humorous cartoons." So he gradually developed this idea of silly machinery, but in 1910 he had done a series called Am Tag, die Deutsche Kommen. And this was very much poking fun at these scaremongers, these people who were saying that Germany was a real threat. And this is the very first cartoon that Heath Robinson created, and it's German spies in Epping Forest, so not too far from where I live. And it's showing the absurdity of it. You've got German soldiers dressed up as birds in Epping Forest trees, while a lone little Boy Scout wanders along unawares. Now, what's quite interesting about this cartoon was it was reported that this cartoon was published in the German press during the war as proof of how rattled the British were about Germans. I don't know whether this is true. How the Germans are often presented as humorless, but to not get this joke does seem quite bizarre. Nevertheless, that was reported in the British press. So there's a couple more. I'll just show you another one as well. This is the German spies in the Greco-Roman galleries of the British Museum. So not doing a terribly good job of disguising themselves as statues. There was another one where they were on a ferry across the channel, but they were, their sort of boxes of brot and sausages and beer rather showed them up. So in a way, Heath Robinson has already got this blueprint of German soldiers ready to go when war breaks out. And what he depicts is actually a very old-fashioned Prussian view of the German military. There they are. They've always got absolutely very rotund bellies. And this is an early one. And again, there's that title, Culture. And this is the first lesson in the goose step. Now, Heath Robinson often put this little gosling into his cartoons, both before the war and during. So here we are, literally teaching the German army how to goose step. And then he starts to create cartoons, not just for the sketch, but for the Illustrated Sporting Dramatic News, which was a lovely large A3 publication. So the cartoons in that were beautifully reproduced. And this is one of those, the Kamerad Counter, as you can see, just pointlessly counting the number of German soldiers. And I particularly like this one, Mine and Countermine. It's always just so silly. And, this is what Heath Robinson does. He dilutes the fear of war with laughter. And he often, he always laughs at the Germans, but he actually encourages the British to laugh at themselves as well. And what he did was, he was so popular with the British soldiers is they would often write letters to him suggesting ideas for contraptions, and some of which he did actually turn into cartoons. He did this series in a sketch called The Breaches of the Hague, German Breaches of the Hague Convention. And this is one of my favourites. It's the German using button magnets to ping the buttons off the Tommies' trousers so they can't attack because their trousers are falling down. And then there's these sort of hilarious domino effect style cartoons. So the point on this clock tower spikes an airship captain at table, and the spike on his Pickelhauer helmet spikes the airship. So it all becomes disastrous. They're not often terribly violent, but this one, which I think is called the Kitchener Bosch Bayonetta, is rather nasty. So these unsuspecting Germans in their trench are about to get skewered by this audacious attempt by these airmen. But what really happens in Heath Robinson cartoons, it's like Tom and Jerry. They just live to sort of fight another day. This one is the Germans using tacho bombs, and tacho was a hair restorer of the time. So, the British Tommies are aghast that their hair is growing. This one's quite nice to show on Zoom. It doesn't show up very well when I give this talk, you know, in actual venues, but this one is quite amusing, and it's Germans lowering gramophones over a British sentry, literally with the aim of boring him to death with German hymns and patriotic songs. So they've killed him with their dullness. Now, while Heath Robinson was creating these cartoons, he was living in Pinner, sort of northwest suburbs of London. So he was experiencing the home, you know, life on the home front, although probably from a, you know, fairly safe distance from the capital. So a lot of his cartoons also, you know, use this as a subject, and I particularly like this, which is, you know, typically self-deprecating British humour. When the raider drops in, don't surrender, don't attack him with your garden fork, don't offer him a cocktail and a cigar, but do sit on him and wait patiently for the special constable to arrive. So the home front obviously provided inspiration to other cartoonists as well. And this one is by James Thorpe, who was well-known cartoonist, member of the Sketch Club, and he would have been friends with John Hassell, who created the original poster of Skegness is So Bracing, which hopefully you're all familiar with. And Skegness So Bracing was first designed in 1908, was a huge hit. And there is James Thorpe paying tribute to his friend's design with this cartoon, which comments on the East Coast bombardments of December 1914, saying the East Coast is so bracing. And at the bottom, he very gallantly says, with apologies to the famous Hassell poster. And then there's lots of other themes that come through, particularly wartime knitting. I've written a little book on wartime knitting, and it was just an enormous nationwide effort to knit socks and comforts for soldiers. But it also provoked plenty of jokes as well. And this is Mabel saying, "Mother dear, I do hope the war won't be over before I finish my sock." Apparently turning the heel of a sock was quite a skill that not everybody managed to managed. Or this poor old gentleman who is being used to wind wool by the female members of the family. And this cartoon by Tony Sarge. Now, you know, there was a lot of concern and fear about potential air raids in those early months of the war, and you know, for men who had actually had to go over and experience war at the front, civilians' nerves were probably rather annoying. And this cartoon, I suppose, you know, comments on that. War nerves, terrible effect of a clap of thunder, a result of undigested war news. Is it a Zeppelin bomb? And then there's the coal gas vehicles, which were brought in a little bit later when petrol became in short supply. And this cartoon is by Alfred Leet. Now, Alfred Leet, you will know better as the creator of the famous Kitchener front cover of London Opinion, which became a kind of unofficial poster, and, you know, in the last century has probably become one of the best known images of the war. But anyway, these coal gas fueled cars were a really comical sight and irresistible for cartoonists. This is by Alfred Leet. It's called Observable Observers, and the chauffeur says, "What are you hanging around here for?" And the little children say, "Please, mister, we're waiting for the balloon to go up." And then you've got this one, which is rather fun as well, by George Stamper. This is a double joke, really, because not only is this poking fun at the gas bag cars, it's also poking fun at female chauffeurs, because obviously lots of women you know, became motorists. "You'll have to get rid of the chauffeurs, Alfred. She's getting much too flighty." And then you've got cartoons. This is actually a postcard rather than a magazine cartoon by Reg Morris, which are a little bit suggestive and are, you know, I suppose almost sexualizing female war workers. But it's, yeah, it is innocent fun, I suppose. This is a fabulous cartoon. I think it was in the Bystander, and it's actually from November 1918, so towards the end of the war. But it's by J.H. Dowd, who went on to become very well known for drawing children, actually. But the caption to it is, "Would you be so good as to get me a pail of water, my man?" And the patient says, "Dash me, woman, I'm a major." "Dash me, man, I'm a duchess." Well, this is sort of a perfect theme for Bystander readers, because it was well known that society ladies like to help out in hospitals and the like. So, yeah, a bit of an in-joke for them there. And back to Heath Robinson, there's obviously the issue of, you know, food rationing, or at least food control. Rationing obviously came in right towards the end of the war. But food control, trying to encourage people not to eat too much. So Heath Robinson's helpfully provided some machines to measure your girth in restaurants to make sure you don't overeat. And this is a female cartoonist, Annie Fish, just known as Fish. She drew all the little illustrations for the gossip column in the Tatler called Letters of Eve. And they're really charming and very modern, very kind of, you know, looking forward to Art Deco in style. And this is one of her examples of her work. Heath Robinson again, a kinder use for submarine mines, helping elderly people to mount the stairs. This makes me laugh, that one. And this one's rather fun as well, which is, I can't remember the title, but this is a munitions worker so used to making shells is she's gone back to work for her old employers, and she's accidentally made the spotted dick in the shape of a shell, a bomb, much to the alarm of her employers. Probably the most kind of popular cartoon to sort of bridge the gap between soldiers and civilians was by Frank Reynolds. And I showed you one of Frank Reynolds' cartoons earlier, showing really brutish German soldier. But his most popular one is just really, really effective, which I'm going to show you in a minute. And it's very light-hearted, and it's a depiction of the German home front, actually. Now, obviously, the British had their own wartime songs, It's a Long, Long Way to Tipperary and the like. Well, the Germans had the Hymn of Hate. And what Frank Reynolds was doing was he, in this cartoon I'm about to show you, was showing the British perception of Germany's obsession with their hatred of the British. So it is a Prussian household having its morning hate. So you've got a very glowering father and children. You know, they've got the bristly moustache, which all Germans have, and the little round glasses, and of course even the dash on there in the front is getting annoyed thinking about the British. And it was a huge hit, this cartoon. And this bit next shows an advert, and people could order it as a print from Lawrence and Jellicoe of Covent Garden, who were art and book publishers. And I love this comment, which the correspondent Valentine Williams of the Daily Mail says, and he's at General Headquarters, and he says the latest jokes about the war are lovingly dwelt on, and the artist who drew for Punch the sketch of the German family indulging in its morning hate against England would feel that his labours were amply repaid if he knew how much his clever satire was appreciated at General Headquarters. So I think everybody can appreciate that sort of joke. As I said, it's a very unifying subject. So there are other cartoons which, you know, suggest sort of make fun of Germans who aren't soldiers. And this one is from Punch, and it's showing how quickly German shopkeepers had to change things. You know, obviously there was a large German population in UK when war broke out, lots of them in London, lots of them in seaside towns, working as waiters, hairdressers, shopkeepers, musicians. And anyway, here you are. Johann Schmidt has very, very quickly swapped his Dachshund for a nice English terrier. He's selling pickles, not sauerkraut, and he's offering ginger beer lemonade rather than hock. Anyway, yeah, that's the sort of thing that. Oh, and the poor old Dachshund came in for some terrible stick as well. So here it is as the kind of I was going to say personification, but caninification of the German Navy. You know, staying in port and not coming out to meet the British. And if you can see in the background, there's the British with the bulldog in the middle, you know, waiting to do battle. And that is also by Alfred Leet. And even in America, this is by Paul Starr, this cartoon. And you've got a little American boy very patriotically holding the Union flag and holding a toy pistol at a poor, very innocent looking dachshund with memories, I suppose, of the American Revolution behind him. Here's Alfred Leet again, and his most popular creation of the war was Schmidt the Spy. And again, this taps into another concern of the British population, that there were German spies everywhere. And certainly in the first few months of the war, everybody was doing cartoons about this because everybody was really, really on edge about it. Anyway, Schmidt the Spy was created in London Opinion and was made into little books. Usually most of the most popular cartoons, series of cartoons, would be then published in some sort of, you know, perfect bound special magazine or book. And following on from this suspicion about, you know, Germans in England, this lovely cartoon by Claude Shepperson in Punch has Ethel in apprehensive whisper which easily reaches her German governess, to whom she is deeply attached. Mother, shall we have to kill Fraulein? Well, you know, it's it's obviously an exaggeration, but it was certainly for middle and upper class families probably, you know, an actual issue. I mean, even the royal family, Princess Mary's governess or nurse, I think, was German, and they had to say goodbye to her. So, you know, although lots of these cartoons are exaggerated, they are couched in, you know, real experiences. And just in case we might doubt the Dachshund's, you know, loyalty, then here is the Kaiser and his daughter, Victoria Louise, with two very sleek, very relaxed looking Dachshunds. And I'm using this picture as a segue into the depiction by cartoonists of the Kaiser. Now, Kaiser is basically, he was a walking caricature. He's absolute, you know, just gold for cartoonists. For everything from his posturing, his love of military uniforms, his wax mustachios, he just was ripe for caricature. So let's show you a few examples of this. We've got his F.H. Townsend again, who is creating the cover of the Punch Almanac. And Mr. Punch here is St. George using the Union Jack to slay the Kaiser as the dragon. And this is a good example of a cartoonist who was, you know, formerly best known as a political cartoonist, Edward Tennyson Reed, who did a lot of work for the Graphic and the Bystander. And here he is depicting the Kaiser quite brilliantly as the head of the German vampire. And E.T. Reed's got a really very personal style. He usually drew in pencil, which is quite unusual compared to other cartoonists. And here's Alec P.F. Ritchie again, who I said drew in all types of styles, and he literally is showing the Kaiser as the ogre from Jack and the Beanstalk, V5 from. And then, quite a unsettling image, which is the Kaiser as the Death Mask of Europe by Philip Baines on the cover of the Tatler. I mean, think of the magazine Tatler today and how much it's changed. They certainly wouldn't be putting anything like this on the cover. But the Kaiser's face is made up of, bodies and battling soldiers. Very cleverly done. And then the last time I gave this talk, just a day or so before, one of our contributors at Mary Evans brought in this brilliant cartoon by Harry Furniss, another well-known Punch cartoonist. And there was also another revelation with it, which was it was done for a magazine called The Cartoon, which I hadn't heard of before. And I've still got to try and find some copies of it. But anyway, this was a big fold-out image, and it's just showing the Kaiser in all sorts of different violent guises. It's brilliantly done, and the Kaiser's monster carnival of terrorism as arranged by himself in heaven, on land, in the air and under the sea. And just to show you the size of it, there we are. That's Terry who found it. That it is unfurled. So rather special, but probably not something you want to have on your wall. Then I mentioned Wilhelm's love of uniform, and prior to the war, the British and the Germans were always swapping uniforms as a mark of sort of honour and respect. Anyway, here we have him. I discard your uniforms and your orders, and John Bull says the honour is mine. And that again is Alec Ritchie. And thinking about that and the fact that the British royal family had to distance themselves from their German relatives. Here's George V by Leonard Ravenhill, another very famous Punch cartoonist, sweeping away his German titles and replacing Saxe-Coburg Gotha with Windsor. And then the Kaiser's elder son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, was another subject that cartoonists regularly chose to caricature. And whereas the Kaiser is often quite monstrous, actually the Crown Prince comes across, he's always drawn as quite weaselly and sneaky. And there's nothing better here than Edwin Morrow's depiction of him stealing some, valuables from a chateau where he'd stayed, which apparently was a report on the paper, which the cartoonists very quickly picked up on. One of the best caricaturists of the Kaiser and the Crown Prince was W.K. Hazelden, and a picture of him there. And he was a cartoonist for the Daily Mirror, and he created this rather wonderfully naive, silly cartoon, the sad experience of Big and Little Willie during the first 6 months of the Great War, as portrayed by W.K. Hazelden. And it's just really wonderful because it just mocks them. It makes them small and silly and inconsequential. And here's an example of a strip cartoon by Hazelden, showing the Kaiser and Little Willie trying to fight a war on two fronts and just ending up looking extremely silly. And I actually know W.K. Hazelden's granddaughter, who is now the picture editor of History Today magazine. So there you are. I thought it would be interesting to also show some non-British cartoonists as well. and how they depicted both the Kaiser and the British. So this is, this is, I can't remember who this is actually, apologies, but this is a really quite terrifying depiction of the Kaiser as the mad dog of Europe, and of course America is coming to capture it. And then we have a run of this magazine at work. It's absolutely superb magazine, La Baïonnette, which was themed for every issue. And here is the Red Kaiser, looking again quite terrifying, quite unhinged, and a very, very powerful image. And you will see a difference really between the French and German cartoonists compared to the British cartoonists. They're much more bold, and they fill up the space, and they're not afraid to perhaps depict sometimes distasteful things. Anyway, here's one depiction of how the French saw the German officers, le officier, and just how they saw the Germans generally. They were often depicted as gluttonous, overweight, greedy. This is by Paul Irebe. Now, Paul Irebe actually is probably better known as an illustrator of more kind of romantic and feminine topics. He was one of the key illustrators of the fashion magazine Gazette de Bon Ton. But here he is in La Baïonnette with this superb double-page spread showing death reaching out to the Kaiser against this black background. This is by Gerda Wegener, and if anybody watched the film The Danish Girl, Gerda is this artist, and this is Le Cadeau du Fiancé, so a present from her fiancé, and rather horribly, it's a hand worn by a typically ugly German Frau, or Fraulein, I suppose it was fiancé. Here's another artist much better known for fashion drawings, Georges Barbier, and here he shows, and you can see this, sort of very elegant Art Nouveau style, showing these mermaids trying to escape from the German U-boats. Criticism of profiteers happened on both sides of the channel, and here's a rather striking image showing a fat cat businessman doing very well. This is Gerda Wegener again, the poor old dachshund again. Ils ont des oreilles, they have ears. So this is showing three fashionably dressed ladies in Paris saying, you must not talk, which, is a sort of phrase which was picked up again in the Second World War, walls have ears and all that, and fougasse, all that kind of thing. But this is, it's a very artistic, elegant drawing. And then, what I think is really interesting is looking at how each of the warring nations saw each other. And this is a German cartoon showing the Turks sweeping the Allies off from Gallipoli, the Dardanelles campaign. And, it is interesting to look at this to show, after you've been looking at so many British cartoons, that this is really sort of making the British look very small and ineffective. And what and here is Haig being given a thrashing by Hindenburg, and the way that Haig is depicted there is really typical of how Germans saw the British generally. They were always very sort of bony, with sort of hollow cheekbones and gnarly teeth, and big hands and feet, but skinny. And whereas the Germans, even are presenting themselves as a little bit more kind of solid. So you'll see this again. This is actually the French view of the British Tommy as well, which is just the most brilliant, brilliant cartoon by Gus Bofa. And if you look at those flickering sort of films of British soldiers at the front or wherever, you can see that face so brilliantly. It really does seem to epitomise the typical British Tommy or the British officer. And this is by Sem, really famous French cartoonist, probably best known for his work around the sort of Belle Epoque era of society and everything. But here's a lovely cartoon showing the British striding across the Channel, ships following La Part de l'Angleterre. So, how we, how others perceived us as sort of, quite important, I suppose. And that brings me on to this next cartoon, which appeared on the front cover of The Bystander in 1916. And it landed The Bystander into really hot water. So it's called Reported Missing, and it was drawn by Second Lieutenant C.E.B. Bernard. And it shows, a soldier probably somewhere like Middle East somewhere or whatever, and he's drunk anyway. And this caused absolute condemnation. Let me just find, let me have a look. Yeah, the Times said, it is a disgusting representation without any humour and is offensive to a degree, but because it is over a signature of an officer. And The Bystander actually had to appear in court over this cartoon because it was considered prejudicial to the discipline and to the recruiting of His Majesty's forces. So this is an officer drawing, one of his men potentially drunk, and it just was not. It suggested that discipline was not, not very good in the British Army. And this picture is appearing on the front cover of a magazine. Who knows who might see it? Anyway, The Bystander was fined £100. The editor, Vivian Carter, and the artist, Bernard, were both fined £50 each. And actually, within a few weeks, Vivian Carter, the editor, was dismissed completely. He had published a photograph of a recruiting officer in Trafalgar Square, and the said officer complained and said that he'd been misrepresented, and so Carter had to go. Now, we look at this today and it seems fairly harmless, ill-judged perhaps, but a sacking matter doesn't really seem so. But that's how sensitive things were. And, I'm not really sure how this got past the censor, because lots of cartoons which appear in The Bystander and The Sketch and The Tattler will say passed by the censor underneath. And I'm never quite sure about whether they only had to submit a certain portion of cartoons, and maybe this one slipped through, and it was only once it was published that people decided it wasn't acceptable. So poor old Vivian Carter has to pick up his P45, which seems very short-sighted, because Carter is instrumental in discovering and establishing the First World War's probably greatest cartoonist, this man. And I think probably most of you, if you are members of the Western Front Association, will know his name. It's Captain Bruce Bairnsfather of the Royal Warwickshires. And there he is in a publicity photograph. He was quite a handsome man, and had these soulful eyes, and wore his officer's uniform pretty well. So, a bit of background to Bairnsfather. He was born in India. He came from a military family and was sort of, I suppose, destined to join the army himself. But he certainly had an artistic streak. He drew a lot at school. He was very interested in the theatre. He was always visiting the theatre in Birmingham. But he joined the army and then had a change of heart. And in 1907, he left, determined to be an artist. and he joined John Hassell's art school in Earl's Court. Now, John Hassell had established the school in 1906, and it attracted a lot of very talented people, as well as kind of, you know, well-known people. Robert Baden-Powell studied there, for instance, and Hassell set it up with his friend Dudley Hardy, and both of them together were real stars of the poster art scene. So Ben's father just kind of gave up his, you know, military career to become an artist, and he was taught at John Hassell's school by Charles van Havermaet, who in turn had actually taught John Hassell in Antwerp. He was a Belgian artist, and he came over to London and sort of set himself up there as a tutor at Hassell School, and he also ran his own studio. And Charles van Havermaet really took Ben's father under his wing. But Ben's father really struggled to find enough work to justify becoming an artist, and he felt very keenly that he didn't want to be a burden on his family. And although he had, you know, a few sort of adverts bought here and there, no great success, and he actually ended up joining an electrical lighting firm as an engineer. And that's what he was doing when war broke out in 1914. And what he did was he rejoined his old regiment, the Royal Warwickshires, and he became a machine gun officer. And he went over to the Western Front, and like many men, you know, he was, I think he was around between Armentières and Ypres, if I remember rightly. Anyway, what he did was sketched a lot, and he had a dugout, and he covered the walls of the dugout with little sketches, and then he started doing them for colleagues who were really impressed with what he was doing, made them laugh. And, you know, drawing, I'll talk about this a little bit later, drawing was a way to pass the time when there was nothing else to do. And so many accounts talk about it wasn't just the fighting, it was the waiting that was fraying men's nerves at the front. And so drawing was, you know, I suppose the Great War equivalent of mindfulness, and it really helped pass the time. But Ben's father clearly had a talent, and his friends suggested he send a picture off to one of the illustrated papers, and he decided to send one to the Bystander. And this is the picture which appeared on the 31st of March 1915. Where did that one go? Now, you know, Ben's father says that he sent it off and thought no more about it. Actually, at the time, he was clearly sending other things off because, hang on, that's the second cartoon that was published a little bit later. But this advert for Beecham's Pills. Now, Beecham's Pills, I think, seem to encourage soldiers to send in cartoons, which they used in their advertising. And this appeared in magazines around April 1915. So clearly Ben's father was trying other avenues as well. But this cartoon got a great response from Bystander readers. And so so they asked for another one, and this was the second one. There's his advert, and then he did another one for Beecham's, and this is the original artwork actually for it. And this is very autobiographical because Ben's father actually ended up in hospital suffering from shell shock in around, I think, April 1915, and while he was recovering, he was visited by the business manager of the Bystander, and they had such a great response, and they really saw potential, and they offered him a permanent kind of contract that he would provide them with at least one cartoon a week, and they would pay him, and they would hold the copyright. And he went, yeah, where do I sign up? And so for the rest of the war, Ben's father continued to work for the Bystander. And the Bystander actually turned Ben's father into a global brand. This is a lot of the cartoons were put together into portfolios called Fragments from France. So each time a new Fragments from France came out, kind of newsagents at railway stations were lined up with them. And then you could order some of the prints in colour, limited editions, sometimes signed, like this one. And there's another one. Hold on, I'm going to have to go a little bit back and forth here. There's another colour one. I'll go back to that one as well. There we are. So I think some of you out there probably might own one or two pieces of Bairnsfather ware. I've got one downstairs actually above my toaster. And so Grimwade's China started to design a range of china based on Bairnsfather's drawings, and a whole sort of range of merchandise came out, jigsaws, postcards. The one on the bottom left, that is Flying Colours. And eventually, Bairnsfather's cartoons made it onto the stage as a sketch in a review at the London Hippodrome called Flying Colours. So I'm just whizzing back up here. This one's unusual actually, because Bairnsfather doesn't show the Germans as much as some other cartoonists. And what he really concentrates on, there's another one. What he really concentrates on is the sort of lived experience of the British soldier. And he just had this knack of evoking what the conditions were like, but also that kind of casual stoicism, the sort of cheerful cockiness of the British Tommy. And the British soldiers loved to see this. They loved that you know, Bairnsfather could see that in themselves, and that he was able to create it on the printed page. And people at home loved it as well, because, you know, it showed a humour that British people could kind of really relate to. And I think Bairnsfather cartoons were creating the water cooler moments of the time. You know, people would say, have you seen the latest Bairnsfather cartoon? And, you know, even if you didn't buy the Bystander, which by the standards of that time was quite an expensive magazine at sixpence, it would be shared around and postcards would be, you know, distributed. Or you might save up and buy Fragments from France, so you could have all Bairnsfather's cartoons in one place. And he just, you know, he somehow just got it. So you know, this is a typical one, which is the eternal question: when the hell is it going to be strawberry? Which is a sort of like, you know, in a way a minor domestic matter, but something that really bothered any British soldiers who were absolutely sick to the back teeth of plum and apple jam. So Bairnsfather got all this because he was a serving soldier. Here's another sort of jam-related one as well. Colonel Fitz-Shrapnel receives the following message from GHQ. Please let us know as soon as possible the number of tins of raspberry jam issued to you last Friday, when all hell is breaking loose around him. And then in November 1915, Bairnsfather's most famous cartoon, Well, If You Knows of a Better Hole, Go to It, was published in the Bystander. It wasn't published in colour like this. It was black and white originally, and then it was reproduced as prints and postcards and on plates and whatever. And you know, I think it's Tony and Val Mayholt who have written you know, a really good book on Bruce Bairnsfather. I think they sum it up as you know, the grass is greener proverb, it you know, made real. And it's just a sort of a perfect little joke that everybody understands. And Bairnsfather was so popular, he was asked to go and spend time with the US Army when they were over there, because his cartoons were morale boosting. You know, they were absolutely it. Let me read a little bit from Vivian Carter, not to be kept down, did write a book called Bruce Bairnsfather, a few fragments from his life. And this is what Carter says about Bairnsfather's popularity. Christmas 1915 marked the lowest level of the Allied fortunes, and angry pessimism was the note of the day. We, the Allied nations, were in a knoll, and we knew it, and the question we were all wrangling about between bombardments was whether the future was going to show things worse or possibly better. There was therefore a symbolism about the better old picture that raised it altogether above the ordinary fragment level. The public saw it and collapsed. I think I need to, there we are, we need a visual on that. It was the limit. A funny picture enough, that of two men engaged in a furious squabble in the midst of a bombardment, but the question of the quarrel, i.e. whether by any possible chance either of them could be in a worse predicament, seems somehow to hit the public in its tenderest spot. No cartoon of the war, in actual fact, hit the public so much as that of the two desperate men in that Johnson hole. A series of other transactions followed, which Bairnsfather fired each time and did not once miss the ball. The uniform acceptability of his work became a joyous monotony in the editorial office. What was something of a revelation, however, was the instant appreciation that greeted his early sketches from the military itself. A storm of enthusiasm, too rare, alas, in readers of illustrated papers, broke over the officers of the Bystander as a result of the first of the Bairnsfather fragments. And here's some of the letters that Carter received at the Bystander office from soldiers. Everyone here is talking about the pictures. I think they are perfect. By far away the best and most lifelike caricatures we have seen of the war, wrote one subaltern. You have livened many a dull hour in the trenches, wrote another. The best products of the war, true to life as a dot, all details correct. The true story of things as they exist. We simply howled. All Bairnsfather's pictures are on the walls in our mess room. Absolutely it. And so on and so forth ran the letters that poured into the officers from somewhere in France, together with applications to have first refusal of the originals when offered for sale. And then Carter goes on to sort of sum up Bairnsfather's kind of magic formula. He says he regards the war as it affects the individual, and in no one of his cartoons does he offer one word of criticism of the war in itself, no, not even where the Hun himself is concerned. So, you know, I don't think I can really put it any better than Vivian Carter about what Bairnsfather sort of meant. I thought I'd show you this one, A Visit to the Alpini, and this was considered by Charles Dana Gibson. Charles Dana Gibson, well-known American illustrator who created the Gibson Girl. And he considered this Bairnsfather's best cartoon. And I think it's rather wonderful. The war is over for some time, but this man hasn't heard about it yet, and nobody can get up to tell him. His sniping is therefore very annoying to that Austrian village in the valley. It reminds me a little bit, I think, I can't remember, there might have been an episode of It Ain't Half Hot Mum once where somebody had, you know, there was a Japanese man on an island who'd refused to believe the war was over, but that's what it reminds me of. So there we've got soldiers reading the Bystander in a trench, which I think is probably quite staged, but, you know, or they may have had one in the trench and thought, let's get a picture of the Bystander, we'll send it into them, I bet they'll publish it, and of course they did. But what it really shows is that these magazines were a really key source of entertainment to people, and making sure that what they published sort of made sense to soldiers was really important. And Bairnsfather in particular and the Bystander really managed to do that, to sort of speak to them and to bridge that chasm, I suppose, between civilians and serving soldiers. So I mentioned that, you know, the Betterol then made it onto the stage in this sketch in flying colours at the Hippodrome with Old Bill, who was the central character of Bairnsfather's cartoons. He's like a curmudgeonly, grumpy, old contemptible with a walrus moustache, who'd been out since Mons. But anyway, John Humphreys played him in this review sketch. And then it was so popular that Bairnsfather and got together with a chap called Arthur Elliott, and they wrote a complete stage play based on Bairnsfather's cartoons called The Better Ole, and it was staged at the Oxford Theatre on Oxford Street and opened in 1917, and was one of 3 or 4 real huge hit shows of the war. And it had many revivals, and it went around the provinces and everything. And but Old Bill was played by Arthur Bouchier. Alfred Lester, was he Bert or Alf? I can't remember which one he was, but anyway, it was a huge success. And it was great. It was actually great for Bairnsfather, because Bairnsfather had such a love of theatre. So to be able to get involved in that side of things as well was very satisfying for him. And the name Old Bill really became part of the lexicon of the Great War, and he is a bus being George V meeting the bus called Old Bill, which had been to the front. So Bairnsfather, even before he became a real superstar, the publisher Grant Richards saw potential here. What happened was Grant Richards' manager was a serving soldier, and he had several brothers who were also fighting. And one of them sent a copy of Fragments from France home to his manager's mother or something. And his manager showed Fragments from France to Grant Richards, and Grant Richards, always a real sort of opportunist publisher, a bit of a maverick, sort of, made lots of money, lost lots of money, but he saw potential in, getting Bairnsfather to write his wartime memoirs. And he approached him. He had to go to the Isle of Wight, which is where, after being wounded, Bairnsfather was training men on the Isle of Wight, and he met him there and signed him up. And the bystander were furious about this, that Bairnsfather had gone behind their back and signed a book deal with Grant Richards, and it took quite a few meetings for the bystander to realise that, well, okay, if there's going to be a book about him, then I suppose that's only going to be good for the magazine and all our other business interests which are connected to Bairnsfather. So Bullets and Billets came out, and then also the bystander was very lucky to have the graphic, and the bystander had the Graphic Art Gallery, which is based on the Strand in London, and it would have regular art exhibitions, and it had 2 Bairnsfather exhibitions during the war, and this is a picture taken from the first one, which is wonderful. It's not signed, but I think it is by an artist called Douglas Mackenzie, and it's a view from inside the gallery looking out, and all those people stopping by the windows of the graphic gallery to laugh at Bairnsfather's cartoons. Now, if one could go back in time, going back in time to the Strand Gallery in 1916 and picking up a few Bairnsfather cartoons for not very much money might be a very good idea and quite a decent investment. But Bairnsfather wasn't the only one who was, portraying the British soldier as this sort of cheeky Tommy who jovially put up with these horrendous conditions. This is F.H. Townsend again in Punch, and the incorrigibles. New arrival at the front. What's the programme, old hand? Well, you lay down in this water and you get peppered all day and night and you have the time of your life. New arrival. Sounds like a bit of all right. I'm on it. Here we have soldiers reading the Tatler. I'm not sure whether he should be doing that while his friend is, clearly having to concentrate, but, any opportunity to get in the magazine. So another artist who really summed up that typical British cockiness is Bert Thomas with this illustration, Arthur Moe Kaiser, which he did for the Weekly Dispatch Smokes for Tommy campaign, which aimed to, raise money to send thousands and thousands of cigarettes to the front. And Bert Thomas apparently dashed this illustration off in just a few minutes. But it was another big hit. It was reproduced in enormous size and hung up in Trafalgar Square for starters, and, reproduced as postcards and limited prints and so on. And, it's just got that cheeky, chappy quality to it, which the British like to see that in themselves. No airs, no graces, but a certain type of sort of casual confidence. I just wanted to introduce you to a few more artists. This is an illustration by Fred May, who did caricatures for the Tatler, and during the war he tended to either visit particular places, which might be a military hospital, or particular regiments, and draw key characters. And the character I want to really point you in the direction of is the chap in the middle, Lieutenant H.L. Oakley, Harry Lawrence Oakley of the Yorkshire Regiment. He was in the Green Howards. He was a staff officer, actually. But Oakley was very well known as the man with the magic scissors, and he was an absolutely superb silhouette artist. And if you look closely at that picture, you can see that he's got his scissors in his left hand, and he's got silhouettes surrounding him. So I just wanted to show you a couple of examples. And actually, Bairnsfather was in the Bystander, so was Oakley. Oakley was known as Oakley of the Bystander. But these examples I'm going to show you, which are a little bit more humorous, were done for the Dump magazine, which is one of the trench newspapers, magazines, which flourished at the time. And here's Oakley doing a few humorous silhouettes based on, his own experience at the front. And then there's Lawson Wood, who in the sort of 1930s, some of you may know of a character called Grandpop, who was a wily old orangutan and had lots of little monkeys and pigs for friends, and there was Grandpop annuals and all sorts of things. But Lawson Wood, he served actually in the kite balloon section, and he was a balloonatic, and he was decorated by the French, so he's very brave. But like most serving artists, he also would do the odd illustration. He started off by doing some posters, which are quite serious and Victorian in their approach. But he also did lots of cartoons. This is for the Illustrated Sporting Dramatic News, and which the Illustrated Sporting Dramatic News, because it covered so much to do with horses, racing and hunting and whatnot, was very interesting cartoons to do with naughty horses and members of the Army Remount Service trying to tame absolutely crazy horses and mules. So this is Peace Negotiations by Lawson Wood. And here's horses again. This is a cartoon, actually, commandeered. So the army have even taken this little boy's toy horse. And then I wanted to talk about this artist, Harold Earnshaw, known as Pat Earnshaw among his friends. He'd been in the Artist Rifles, but he was then, I think he was a corporal he's in the Sussex Regiment. And he was an artist before the war, and he was married to Mabel Lucy Atwell, who if you don't know her name, you'll know her pictures, well known for chubby-faced, chubby-kneed, cute children. And actually Mabel Lucy Atwell did plenty of stuff during the First World War. But she and Harold married in 1908. They'd met at art school, and she was probably the more successful artist, but he was pretty good as well, and illustrated a lot of children's books, and they sometimes collaborated on pictures. He might do sort of animals or trees and something, but she would focus on the figures. Anyway, Pat joined up, and he was on the Somme, and in February 1913, the most awful thing happened to him, and he talks about it himself, and this is from a magazine interview he gave, and I will read it out. There was nothing unique about it. It happens most days out there, that or worse. I had been doing patrol duty along a length of light railway for a fortnight, every now and then becoming motive power to trolleys for the front line. Myself and another were doing this very thing when I was pipped. We were shoving up behind, our four hands on the back of the truck, and our bodies bent forward like a rugger scrum of two against the opposing wagon. The right arm I lost was close to the other chap's left, yet he was not touched. I was also wounded, although I was quite unaware of the fact, in leg and back, and he did not get a scratch. Yet the shell that knocked me out burst right over us. Well, what had happened was Pat had lost his right arm, and that was his drawing arm, which, you know, in normal circumstances would seem absolutely ruinous to somebody. But he actually said he never for 1 minute thought that he wouldn't continue to be an artist. So he ended up in hospital, and amazingly, he was injured in the middle of February, and by July, this picture had appeared in, I think, the graphic, I can't remember what, but anyway, it had appeared in the papers, and this is by him, and he had learned to draw with his left hand. And these are sort of just sketches of fellow wounded soldiers. The one top left says, when you're sent up north and you live down south, so he's not very happy. And then somebody's getting a wash from a nurse, but why, oh why at 3 a.m. and so on and so on. And then here we are, October 1917. His drawing is on the front cover of the Sporting Dramatic News. I think they're very supportive of him, actually, but his pictures are as good as anybody's. He's clearly not quite back to his assured style, but it's certainly not a bad effort. And here's another one. And, you know, he's got this lovely, lovely, cheery style. His subjects are very light-hearted, a small objective. And then this one, this one again could be autobiographical. So here he is looking very pleased with himself. So he may have lost his right hand, but he's getting plenty of attention for being wounded. I just wanted to show a few pictures of these from the 1920s, just to show. He drew a lot of Boy Scouts. So he didn't really lose his touch, and I think it's a remarkable story, and all the more remarkable for how kind of accepting and stoic he was about that injury. You know, he just said, well, I just had to get on with it, and he did. Here's another great cartoonist, perhaps not so well known for his First World War cartoons, but after the war, between the wars, he was Britain's highest paid cartoonist. It's H.M. Bateman, and now he wanted to join up. He was very keen to do his bit, but in training camp he got rheumatic fever, and that was it. That was the end of his war. He was deemed unfit. And so many of H.M. Bateman's cartoons, kind of, you can see he's taken them from his own experiences. What Bateman is really, really good at is drawing feelings and emotions. And this is what he's doing here. You know, this is clearly him, the medical board inspecting him and just feeling like a rather pathetic specimen. And then, you know, he did quite a lot of cartoons, which are almost as if he is protesting too much. This is all about a few splendid fellows who are unfortunately debarred from meeting the Germans and why. So he's drawing people who are giving rather pathetic excuses for not joining up. I mean, this chap in the middle says, oh, dang it, I'm a vegetarian, for instance. And here's another, a man who stayed at home. So I think what he's really wanting to do is distance himself from these people who aren't joining up. You know, he felt very, very bad about the fact he could not do his bit. But what he's really good at, and he's, you know, he's such a modern cartoonist for the time. He does these sequential cartoons, which is very unusual and really kind of groundbreaking. So this one, Attrition, or the driver who was tired. So here he is driving along, not noticing 1 minute until he's left with a tiny piece of steering wheel. Or this one where he asks for some help starting his car and gets a very big burly guy to help, who actually just doesn't just crank the car, he turns it over in its entirety. And here's gas bag cars again, you know. But there's something, you know, Bateman's got this wonderful dynamic style. He's just a superb cartoonist. This one showing dropping a bomb. It's great at exaggerating things. And this one, it's a long, long way to go to the CO. So It's just from private to pensioner. It's taken so long for him to go through the various people that he has to go just to ask something of the commanding officer. He looks like Methuselah by the end of it. Well, he's a Chelsea pensioner, basically. So Bateman, as well as Ben's father, was a student at John Hassell's art school. And what is really interesting is that John Hassell's art school, which started in 1906, had studios in Earl's Court, had to close due to the war because clearly nobody could commit to attending physical lessons. But what he did was he reopened it as a correspondence course. So yeah, obviously Bateman had long gone by then, but so plenty of people could sign up for this correspondence course. And Hassell wasn't the only one doing this. He was joined by Percy Bradshaw, who ran the Press Art School in Forest Hill, and Charles Dawson also ran a correspondence course as well. Charles Dawson had been art editor of Nasher's magazine. So there was this industry of correspondence art schools, and they really targeted soldiers. This is a picture that Ben's father drew of himself, drawing on the walls of an old farmhouse in France, which was that was sort of the catalyst for his career as, the war's greatest cartoonist, I suppose. And these correspondence schools really tapped into the fact that soldiers enjoyed drawing, or they were encouraging them to draw, not just as a way to pass the time, but as a way to calm the nerves, and a way potentially to be useful at the front. Those who are particularly talented might be called upon to use their drawing skills for reconnaissance duties or the like, and also potentially as a career afterwards if you were good enough. In fact, Charles Dawson even went so far as to say, well, if you become a professional artist, or if you get some extra drawings accepted and paid, then you could buy war loans. Or if you become an artist who can draw recruitment posters, then you are helping the war effort. This whole idea of honing the skill of drawing was part of the kind of war machinery, the war economy. And these art schools really focused on that. This is an advert for Hassell's correspondence school, and he placed these every single week in the Tatler and the Bystander. And I don't know whether you can read that, but there's some very glowing testimonials here. One student writes, "You have opened a new life to me." Another says, "My spare moments are moments of sheer delight." Another pupil is sketching the stirring events in Petrograd. Anyway, and so on, so on. This is for Percy Bradshaw's Press Art School. And they would normally draw a little picture, ask any pupils to copy it, send it in for a free kind of assessment, and then they could sign up for it. And why not be hung? So there you are. Copy this sketch for my free personal criticism. And if you notice that, so you've got two ways that learning to draw or refining your drawing skills can help. Sold 6 more posters, that's one pupil. An antidote to war strain. So again, in recent years, there's been a bit of a colouring book boom, hasn't there? Well, this is, I suppose, the equivalent. And these places were offering something which could be done just with paper and pencil, with very little equipment, could be sort of done anywhere, but gave you something to pass the time, take your mind off things, and possibly, actually acquire a skill for life. Hassell was running his art school, but he was an absolute machine during the First World War in terms of churning out illustrations for charities. He did recruitment posters, he did cartoons. This is a series called Lilus from Berlin. He went to charity events and drew things for free. He did theatre fundraising, charity matinee programme drawings. He I have looked in Hassell's archives at the University of Essex in his logbooks, and in 1917 to 18, these huge big logbooks, every single day he's doing something, and half of it he does for free. So, you know, he's a busy guy, and actually he needs to make a bit of money from the correspondence school to make up for all the stuff he's doing for free. And he's this is actually a Hassell picture, which no doubt he also contributed for free, which is the cover of the Dump Trench magazine. So this was another outlet. If you were into drawing, if you're an amateur artist, you could, you know, if you weren't quite good enough to be published by something like the Bystander or the Sketch, you could instead contribute to your regimental trench newspaper. And again, these were magazines which allowed for soldiers to share in jokes, maybe be a little bit critical of how the war was going, because it was very much between them. So you can see, you know, sometimes the drawing's a little crude, but the humour's there, and you know, must have given people a little bit of a lift to see their pictures published in these papers. At Mary Evans, we've got this really interesting collection which one of our contributors found, and it's around, I can't remember now, about 150, 200 postcards drawn by one man called George Ranstead, who we found out was in the Army Pay Corps. And he sent postcard after postcard back home to his wife in London, and drew all sorts of things, from pretty girls to caricatures of Jerry like this one. And this one of a land girl. So I looked at this and I thought, that's familiar. And then I realised that he copied it. He done a very good copy, because actually, if you look, they're almost identical, these pictures. He copied it from a Beecham's Pills advert. And that in itself, I think, is probably an amateur illustration sent in by a soldier. And George Ranstead has seen it and copied it. And that in turn, I found this, which is a photograph of the American actress and entertainer, Elsie Janis. And she's in exactly the same pose as this. So what I want to show this because it's just a brilliant example of how influential these magazines were, how they were part of soldiers' lives, and how they, you know, boosted morale, lifted spirits. You know, they provided so much for them. So I'm going to end on this picture. Now, this picture is by an artist called Charles Crombie, and it's actually hanging, I should have brought it up actually, it's hanging downstairs in my kitchen above my Bairnsfather plate, and it's called a Blighty. And as you can see, it's a wounded British soldier, not looking too upset about the fact he's been sent home. The, you know, obligatory cigarette hanging from his lips. So the reason I bought this, I bought it from Tennant's Auctioneers, was the picture was published in the Tatler in 1916, and I'm interested in cartoons. Those magazines have kind of, you know, been part of what I've done over the past few years. So I decided to buy it, and I really like it. And then we have another collection at Mary Evans. We represent the collection of the late David Cohen, who was a dealer in, you know, fine art and ephemera of the Great War. And incredibly, as part of David's collection was this picture. And this picture was drawn by Private Freddie Fordham, I think 1st Battalion of the London Scottish, when he was in Military Hospital, Old Town, Eastbourne. And that just goes to show that Private Freddie Fordham had obviously had access to a copy of the Tatler, and he had drawn that picture. And I love the fact that I bought that, and then I discovered that. And it just sort of really does close the circle about how these magazines and these cartoonists were really part of a soldier's life at the time. So that brings me to the end. There's some more cheeky British soldiers wounded, enjoying Bairnsfather's fragments from France. Usually when I give this talk, I give it to people that I can see and hear, and usually there are a few chuckles with the cartoon, so I don't know whether, I hope this has been of interest to you, but allow me a few moments of shameless self-publicity before I finish. My first book, Brushes and Bayonets, which I mentioned at the beginning, is out of print now, but I think there are plenty of copies on Abe Books and things like that. And I was actually looking at it today before doing this talk, and it is a lovely book, even though I do say so myself. And then I've also written these two little books. It's all about Heath Robinson, all about his First World War cartoons, but it also gives a nice little potted biography of him at the front. And the same applies to the book about Bairnsfather, which has most of Bairnsfather's First World War cartoons in it, and again, a biography. So they're all available to buy in one way or another. But in 10 days' time, my new book comes out, which is John Hassell, The Life and Art of the Poster King, who obviously I've mentioned several times during my talk, but he's very much at the forefront of my mind at the moment. And yeah, it's been a labour of love, this one, but I'm really pleased with it. In fact, if you can see, there it is. I've got an advanced copy, and Mike Lee, who's written the foreword, has also got an advanced copy, and he really likes it, so that's all good news. And the book will accompany an exhibition which I'm curating about Hassell at the Heath Robinson Museum in Pinner. And it's, if you're near there, or if you're coming down to London, it's really worth a visit. It's a lovely little museum set in Pinner Memorial Park. It's quite new. There's plenty on Heath Robinson in there. And my exhibition will look at all aspects of Hassell's career, from his work on posters to some politics and some war posters as well. And yeah, it's running all through the summer, 22nd of May to the 29th of August. And finally, obviously I've mentioned Mary Evans. It's not very central, but you can look on Mary Evans' website, and it's free to look, and you get lots of First World War material on there, including cartoons, many of which over the years I've found and captioned and had scanned and added to our online collection. You see very small type there. If you're interested in buying any prints of our images, you can go to prints-online.com. A few other things. We've got a blog, a First World War blog, picturing the Great War on our website. It hasn't been added to for a few years, but there are some actually very interesting blog posts on there, including one about Harold Earnshaw, the artist who learned to draw with his left hand. And some years ago, I also provided quite a lot of text for the illustrated firstworldwar.com, which has kind of biographies of all those magazines in the ILN archive, as well as, biographies of a number of artists who I've mentioned tonight, all written by me. So that is worth checking out. If anybody has any questions or has anything to share with me, I'm always really happy to hear from people. That's my Mary Evans address, actually. Anyway, you can contact me there, and I'm on Twitter as well, so if you are tweeters, please tweet me, and if you've enjoyed the talk, please tweet nice things about it. I'll leave that there for a minute. In fact, I'll go back to it in a minute if anybody wants to take down those details. But I hope you're all still there, and I hope it's of interest. Thank you for listening.
Hi, Lucy. Yeah, everybody is still, the vast majority are still here and thoroughly enjoying that. So thanks ever so much indeed for that excellent presentation. Ladies and gentlemen.
I'm sorry, I've just looked at the time. Sorry, everybody.
It's okay. Don't worry about it. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to do the usual virtual round of applause, please, by pressing the raise hands button on the foot of the Zoom. Lucy, I can confirm that there's literally hundreds of hands going up, which is
all right.
representative of a silent but nevertheless heartfelt round of applause. So thanks for that.
Thank you, everybody. David may be lying, but
no, I'm
to make
not.
me feel better.
It's honestly, there's lots of hands being raised here.
Oh, good.
Time, I'll kick off with one question from somebody who's unfortunately not got a camera, so has asked for this to be asked on their behalf.
Okay.
Which is this is a tricky one. Julia Williams has said, unfortunately, I don't have a camera, but can you please ask Lucy if we know who Old Bill was based on? Julia once had a row with someone who insisted it was based on Churchill, which I disagreed with.
No, definitely not Churchill. Definitely not. So, well, there were lots of there was lots of debate about this in the press because he was such a well-known character. And funnily enough, John Hassell had a very luxuriant moustache. So sometimes, a few people suggested it was based on John Hassell, but there were quite a lot of, older blokes, some of whom might have come into contact with Bairnsfather, who claimed to be the basis of Old Bill. So there's no definitive answer, but lots of people do say, "Oh, I think it was John Hassell." I'm not sure, and John Hassell was too old to join up, so he certainly wasn't. Although he did serve as a special constable.
Super, thanks for that. Do you want to just start your video, Robin, and unmute yourself?
I was fascinated by all this talk of cartoons, having lived in France and built up my collection of sort of Art Deco and Impressionist and poster artists. And I was really interested to hear how, famous artists in England were involved. And I wondered, were there any in the general, other people involved in, say, Impressionism or other forms of art who were sort of brought into the propaganda war effort, as they were in France?
Yeah, they were. I mean, obviously John Hassell is very, very much at the forefront of my mind at the moment. Actually, John Hassell wasn't really a cartoonist. I mean, he's first and foremost a poster artist, although he definitely wanted to be viewed as a fine artist, or an artist in the grand manner. And he actually painted a number of paintings which were sort of, more what we call as more serious works. Such as, he did a real, an allegorical one of, what was it called? It's in the Imperial War Museum, but it's showing two British soldiers in a trench, and it's St. George over the battlefield, sort of this typical kind of subject, I suppose, for propaganda at the time. And there were lots of others as well. And there were lots that sort of combined, I suppose, like more fine, serious art with being distributed through magazines. And I can't remember the name of the artist, but there's one. I've got it downstairs somewhere. It was a dying soldier with Jesus, quite religious, and I can't remember the name of the artist. So this is a proper painting. Hal Hurst was another one. He did a lot of this sort of thing, but it was reproduced as a special presentation plate in the graphic, and it was really, really popular. So I think that was and then there are also all the kind of reportage style magazine artists like Fortunino Matania, people like that, who were trying to give a very authentic view of the war, but at the same time it's quite a biased view of, they're not going to show the British being, ungallant or anything like that. It's always showing the Germans not doing anything, doing something a bit mean, and the British are the kind of the good guys.
But they're all very talented, weren't they?
Yeah. That's it. These artists did work across lots of different media. Hassell was one, Matania's another. Those are two that I know very well. There's there's people like Frank Brangwyn, who's sort of best known sort of for posters and murals, and he was doing stuff. They were all, it was a huge concerted effort by all of them, and lots of them were doing a bit of everything.
That was very interesting about Jesus, because I've got one by Hermann Paul, in which a German soldier goes into the crypt, where baby Jesus is there, and it's exactly that. It's a fascinating talk. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Really
Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks, Robin. Richard, do you want to? Oh, you're unmuted. Richard Crofts, do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you, David and Lucy. I don't know if it's an urban myth or not, but apparently Bairnsfather's central character of Old Bill is the origin of the phrase of the terminology that applies to the police force being referred to as the Old Bill. Is there any truth to that?
Oh, do you know what? I don't think I ever properly made the connection now you mention it. I don't know, possibly. I don't know. That's not very helpful, is it? But I don't know.
Well, no, okay, but that probably suggests it is an urban myth, then, doesn't it?
Well, maybe it is. I tell you what, Mark Warby is the absolute expert on Bruce Bairnsfather. He runs the Bruce Bairnsfather Society. I know he's been working on, hopefully like a really big biography of Bairnsfather's life. I don't, actually Mark might be there. He might be listening, but. If you are Mark, perhaps you might give an answer. But I think that I'm not sure about that.
Okay, that's fine. That's a very good answer. Great talk. Thank you very much.
All right, it's a pleasure.
John Powell. John, do you want to just ask your question there?
Lucy, many thanks for a great talk. One thing that interested me was, although you talked about the German and French cartoonists to a certain extent, was there a French, or possibly less likely a German equivalent of a Fairbrother, Bairns brother, I mean?
I think that Gus, what's his name, was very similar to Bairnsfather because he was very good at, I can't remember his name now, bear with me. I can't remember his name. Sorry, I said it earlier. If anybody can remember, Gus, what's his name? He was very good at depicting kind of, I wouldn't exactly say low lives, but ordinary people and the, the foibles of them in the same way that Bairnsfather did. I mean, I think probably one of the most popular French cartoonists was Poulbeau with the little children, and which is obviously a slightly different approach to what Bairnsfather was doing. In fact, I can't think of any Bairnsfather cartoons that have children in them. But Poulbeau was probably one of the very, very most popular ones at the time. I mean, I showed a cartoon by Sem, who I think is, kind of probably, one of the really huge big names of French cartooning. And he was probably getting more towards the end of his career by the First World War. But I think Gus, whatever his surname is, and if I can look through my notes, I'll find it, is probably the most equivalent. But I don't think anybody did have anyone quite as sort of who hit the nail on the head as well as Bairnsfather did.
Maybe it reflected the British sense of humour, particularly the way it appeals so much to the soldiers on the front line.
Absolutely. I think that was the real nugget, that was the real core to his success.
Yes.
He got them and they got him. And there's nothing better. It's a little bit like Peter Kay's humour. When you'll talk about what it's like at a wedding disco, and everybody just nods their head and laughs and understands. And that's what Bairnsfather did. He just had that common touch and just sort of understood soldiers. And he said when he went to because he did a lot of training and on the Isle of Wight, I think he was sent a lot of kind of older soldiers who were a little bit cheeky and were full of wisecracks. And he just had this knack of capturing their personalities on the page, definitely. But he was, he was asked by other, by the French and by the Americans to spend time with him because he was so well known, to see if he could work at, sprinkle a little bit of Bairnsfather magic on them.
Thanks very much.
That's all right.
Thanks for your question, John. Thank you. Sarah Helen Snow. Sarah, do you want to just fire up your question there?
Hi. In Belgium and France, they have a big tradition of cartoon sort of story kind of things like this. For example, the Big Scene, which is a story of this character behind me. She's a Breton girl and she ends up, you know, going to the front line. She goes as a nurse. Here she's with the Allies. She goes to Turkey. She does all sorts of stuff. Was there anything, you know, it's like the Asterix and Obelix thing. We don't seem to have that sort of tradition, but was there anything in the First World War like that at all?
Yeah, there was. I mean, one name that springs to mind is Chloe Preston, and she did, I want to call them the Boo Boos, but they're not the Boo Boos because that was made by Lucy Atwell. She had a set of characters. If anybody's there is able to Google this for me, Chloe Preston and it was something like Boo Boos, and she did some World War I themed books. Joyce Dennis didn't exactly do stories in the same way, but she did some beautifully illustrated books on YMCA canteen workers and nurses, which were more like ABC things, you know.
Peekaboos. I've just Googled.
Peekaboos, thank you. It's the Peekaboos. I knew something like Boo Boos. Yeah, and those Chloe Preston books, you know, they are really collectible now. And
you know what the Joyce Dennis ones were called at all? No, I can look that up otherwise.
Yeah,
fascinating.
We have one or two of them at Mary Evans, and again, I can't quite remember. Joyce Dennis, Chloe Preston. Yeah, I think a lot of them were aimed at children. John Hassell did. You know, he did a painting book during the First World War, and each page was a well-known brand like Schweppes or Harbert's Plasticine, you know, and the children, and there would be but it would be soldiers doing it or children making something patriotic, you know. So there was an awful lot of children's things. I love that character behind you, though. That's lovely.
That's the Big Scene. That's the French one. Have you not come across that? Look it up. It's fabulous. I mean, you know, she's a bit Laurel and Hardy. She was in service, and then she had, you know, she's a little bit slapsticky, but she does various different things. Yeah, and this is her with I can't even remember. I'd have to look at it. Which I mean, it's obviously in French, but she does all sorts of. But the pictures are delightful because it was done in 1916, and so the style of art is interesting, and well, the whole cartoon. I find it fascinating to see.
It's also just so obviously French, and I've never been able to quite put my finger on what is the difference between French cartoon style and British cartoon style. But you can just.
There is.
And some of it is in the printed colours, you know, and magazines like La Bayonnette, which certainly definitely wasn't for children, wasn't sort of cute, but was still beautifully done.
Yeah. With the Big Scene isn't really child either, although it's cartoony. It's not really for children. No.
Yeah. Okay. But I think there were a few, and actually it was probably more women than men than were producing those sort of books. Drop me an email because it's something I'd quite like to look at a bit more, actually.
Yeah, I will do.
Get in touch.
Okay.
Something else
I shall do.
Might come to me actually as well.
Thanks for your question there, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. John, the last question for this evening is coming from the west coast of Canada. So, John.
Oh, that was terrific, Lucy. Thank you very much. It seemed that almost all the cartooning support was commercial. Now, there was official war art programs and war artists. Was there any official support for cartooning, and how was cartooning seen by the sort of the art community? And
by the art, the art, it was seen as well. I think at the time it was seen as very important indeed, and there were an awful lot of art exhibitions which were happening in London at the time, And it was all part of this thing that cartoons were seen as morale boosting, and exhibitions would be mixed up with serious pictures, cartoons, that sort of thing. I think where cartoons started to lose out was after the war, when other people started to take over, making decisions about what was important in terms of commemorating the war. And Bruce Bairnsfather had a long career after the war, and he was actually still doing cartoons for the Bystander into the Second World War as well. But he toured the North America and everything. However, when the Imperial War Museum, was established, and then sort of over the decades, those kind of cartoons really fell out of fashion, and I think have been not now, but I think in the past, have been woefully underrepresented in collections at certain points. I've got a book downstairs, everything's downstairs, isn't it? I can't remember who wrote it, but it is about war artists. And in the introduction, the artist talks about speaking to an official from the Imperial War Museum. And this is probably in the 70s or something. And he said, well, what about this artist and that artist? And well, they're just illustrators. It's not important. And, so the collecting emphasis was on, the great big Paul Nash and Nevinson and those sort of things. And I think cartoons were, seen as second rate, which if you consider how they were perceived at the time, when they were, really far more important, I think, than the art that was being done by official war artists, certainly spoke more to ordinary people and were distributed far more widely as well, syndicated and replicated in so many different ways. I think it was more important. But, a lot of these artists, as I, answered the question earlier, they would, some of them were equally adept at painting serious work and doing cartoons and doing a poster. So there's a lot of crossover. And a lot of these artists were also there was a very vibrant club scene. I don't mean nightclub scene, I mean as in artistic clubs like the Sketch Club and the Savage Club and places like that, where all these people mingled and swapped ideas and things. So I think, at the time, I think it was considered, really important. And who was it? Was it General Sir Ian Hamilton said that, Bairnsfather called him like the man that won the war.
Right. Well, speaking of which, we're hearing that Brushes and Bayonets are out of print. I'm glad I still have a copy. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question there, John. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we don't have time for any more questions, which is a shame. But we'll have to call that a day right now. So if we'd just like to do a final virtual round of applause by the raising of hands routine again, that'd be tremendous. And so we're still getting hundreds of people raising their hands. Lucy, who've hung on to the end of the questions there. So,
thanks everybody. I know everyone's gone to bed.
Not at all. But this will remain live, not live, but it will remain on Facebook and will be in due course published onto the WFA's YouTube channel. So for everybody who's with us still, don't forget to join us on Thursday for another webinar. We've got Christina Holstein talking about 1917, the French at Verdun. Obviously, we think about the French at Verdun in 16, but Christina's going to tell us something about the French in 1917 at Verdun. We've also got a Saturday conference, a virtual conference on the 1st of May with 6 speakers, 3 in the morning, 3 in the afternoon. So that's not been put on an email yet, but if you want to listen to 6 speakers on Saturday the 1st of May, please do pop to the WFA website and register for that. Lucy, returning to you, thanks very much indeed again for a superb presentation. I've heard you several times, and it's always brilliant to listen to your presentations about the various things you talk about, and this has been a tour de force. If you do you want to just remind everybody of your Twitter handle again?
Yeah, it's at Luci Gosling, and remember it's Luci because it's short for Lucinda. So at Luci Gosling on Twitter.
Super. But Lucy, thanks ever so much indeed for the presentation.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks very much, Lucy. Thanks for watching, everybody. Thank you and good night.
Bye bye.